In the wall of a house in Pickford, Georgia, behind a panel no wider than a dinner plate, a woman hid a photograph for 58 years. She hid it from her husband. She hid it from her pastor. She hid it, most of all, from her daughter. And when that daughter finally found it, 3 weeks after burying her mother, she sat alone on the floor of an empty bedroom and understood, for the first time in her life, that everything she thought she knew about her own family was a story someone else had written for her. The photograph showed a little boy, maybe 4 years old, overalls, bare feet, squinting into the sun outside a house Denise Carter had never seen. On the back, in her mother's handwriting, faded but unmistakable, 7 words: "My firstborn, forgive me, he is loved." Denise Carter was 58 years old. She had been her mother's oldest child for 58 years. That was the truth she had built her entire life on. And in the space of one sentence, written by the woman who raised her, that truth came apart in her hands. Somewhere out there, if he was even still alive, Denise had a brother no one had ever spoken of. Not once, not even by accident, in 58 years. Loretta Mae Carter died on a Tuesday in March, in the same small house in Pickford, Georgia, where she had lived for over 60 years. She was 81. The funeral was modest, the kind of funeral you'd expect for a woman who'd spent 4 decades as a church secretary and never once raised her voice above a Sunday morning hymn. Denise flew in from Atlanta, where she'd built a quiet life as a hospice nurse, the kind of work that teaches you to sit with grief instead of running from it. She thought she understood loss. She thought she understood her mother. She did not expect the 3rd week. That was when she pried up a loose baseboard panel in her mother's bedroom, intending only to check for water damage, and found a shoebox wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. Inside, the photograph, a baptismal pin, a torn page from a 1964 hospital intake form, the kind that listed a mother's name and a child's date of birth, with everything else blacked out by hand. Who was the boy in the photograph? Why had her mother hidden him for 58 years in the walls of her own house, rather than burn the evidence or speak the truth? And if he was alive, who exactly had taken him from her? And why had it taken her mother's death to let the truth out at all? To understand what Loretta Mae Carter hid, you have to understand who she was before she became someone's secret keeper. In 1964, she was 17 years old, the second of 6 children in a sharecropping family outside Pickford, a small town in central Georgia, where the cotton gin still ran 6 days a week, and the county had exactly one doctor willing to see black families, a white physician named Wendell Sumter, whose clinic sat at the edge of town, halfway between the white side and the colored side, as if even the building itself couldn't decide where it belonged. Loretta was smart. Her teachers said so, the few who bothered to write anything on a black girl's report card at all. She wanted to be a teacher herself one day, maybe even leave Pickford for Atlanta, where her cousin had gone, and sent back letters describing a world Loretta could barely picture. She was funny, stubborn, and devoted to her younger siblings, the kind of girl who'd walk 3 miles to bring her brother a forgotten lunch pail, rather than let him go hungry at school. Then, in the fall of 1963, Loretta became pregnant. The father was a young man named Curtis Webb, a field hand 2 years older than her, gentle by every account that survives him, who wanted to marry her the moment he found out. But marriage wasn't a simple thing in Pickford in 1964. Not for 2 teenagers with no land, no money, and a baby coming before either of their families could prepare a wedding. Loretta's mother was terrified, not of the baby, but of what an unmarried pregnant daughter could do to a family standing in a town that judged hard and forgave slowly. She took Loretta to the only doctor who would see her quietly, Wendell Sumter. Dr. Sumter ran what he called, in his private ledgers, a placement service. Officially, it didn't exist. Unofficially, every black family in 3 counties knew that if a girl got pregnant outside of marriage, and her family couldn't bear the shame of it, Dr. Sumter could make the problem disappear. He'd deliver the baby quietly, away from the county hospital and its paperwork, and arrange for the infant to go to a family, sometimes local, sometimes as far as Ohio or Michigan, who wanted a child and would never ask questions about where it came from. The mothers were told, every time, the same comforting lie. The child would be loved, would be raised well, would have a better life than they could give him. They were rarely told where. They were never given a choice that felt like a real choice. Loretta gave birth in March of 1964, in a back room of Dr. Sumter's clinic, with no anesthesia and no family present except her own mother, who held her hand and would not meet her eyes. She was allowed to hold her son for 11 minutes. She named him herself, quickly, quietly, before anyone could stop her. Marcus Webb, after his father. Then a nurse took him, and Loretta Mae Carter did not see her son again for 58 years. What happened next is where the story stops being simple, because it would be easy to imagine Loretta as only a victim and Dr. Sumter as only a villain. The truth, as Denise would learn, was crueler and more tangled than that. Curtis Webb did not abandon Loretta. He fought for her, and for his son, in the only ways available to a poor black field hand in rural Georgia in 1964. He went to Dr. Sumter's clinic 3 times asking where the baby had gone. Each time he was turned away, once by Sumter himself, who told him plainly that the matter was settled and that asking further questions would only bring trouble down on Loretta's family. Curtis didn't stop. He started asking around town, quietly, about which families had recently taken in a baby boy. It was a dangerous thing to do, asking questions a white doctor didn't want asked, in a town where the sheriff and Dr. Sumter played cards together every Friday night. 3 weeks after his son was born, Curtis Webb was arrested for vagrancy outside a diner he'd worked at for 2 years. The charge didn't hold, but it didn't need to. He spent 11 days in the county jail, and when he came out, the message had been delivered clearly enough: stop asking. He did not stop entirely, but he became careful and quiet, and the search slowed to nothing his family could see. Loretta, meanwhile, was sent to live with an aunt in Macon for nearly a year, the official story being that she was helping with a sick relative. When she came home, her family never spoke of the baby again, not once, as if 18 months of her life had simply been edited out of the family record. She married Raymond Carter 4 years later, a kind, steady man who knew about the child. Loretta told him before the wedding, unwilling to start a marriage on a buried lie, and who made her promise never to go looking. Not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid of what looking might cost them both, in a town that hadn't changed nearly as much as people like to pretend. So Loretta kept the photograph Curtis had somehow obtained for her, against impossible odds, smuggled to her through a cousin 2 years after the birth, showing the toddler version of the son she'd held for 11 minutes. She kept it for the rest of her life, hidden first in a Bible, then in a hat box, finally behind a bedroom wall panel her husband had installed for her, for reasons she never explained to him, and he, out of love, never asked. Denise did not sleep the night she found the shoebox. By morning, she had made a decision that would consume the next 4 months of her life. She was going to find her brother, or find out, conclusively, what had happened to him. She started where anyone starts now, with a DNA testing kit, mailed in within the week. While she waited the 6 agonizing weeks for results, she pursued the paper trail. The torn hospital intake form gave her a date and a set of initials. County records from 1964 were incomplete, scattered between 3 different archives after a courthouse fire in 1979, but Denise had patience, and grief gives a strange, focused energy to people who know how to use it. She found Dr. Wendell Sumter's name through an old county medical directory. He died in 1991, but Pickford was small enough and old enough that people still remembered things, if you ask the right people the right way. An elderly woman at Loretta's church, a Mrs. Odessa Pratt, now 93, remembered the rumors from her own girlhood, whispered stories about the doctor who fixed problems, about girls who went away for a year and came back different, quieter, with something missing behind their eyes. Mrs. Pratt gave Denise a name Denise hadn't expected: Curtis Webb. She remembered him too, remembered that he'd asked questions nobody else dared to ask, and paid for it. That single name cracked the case wide open, because it meant the baby hadn't simply vanished into Dr. Sumter's network without a trace. There had been a father who tried to follow him. Denise found a Webb family still living in the area, distant cousins of Curtis, and through them learned that Curtis himself had died in 2009, never having found his son, carrying the search to his grave the same way Loretta had carried her grief to hers. Two people who loved the same child, forbidden by circumstance from ever combining what they each knew. Then, in the 6th week, the DNA results arrived. A match. Half-sibling, 47% shared DNA, consistent with a full biological sibling. A name attached to the profile, Marcus Webb. 58 pounds heavier than the boy in the photograph might have grown into. 58 years older, living 2 hours away in Macon, Georgia, the very city where Loretta had once been sent to hide her pregnancy. An irony so sharp Denise had to sit with it for a long time before she could process it. Marcus Webb had been raised by a local black family who had wanted a son badly enough to take Dr. Sumter's offer without asking too many questions of their own. He had grown up less than 90 miles from the mother who never stopped grieving him. Denise drove to Macon on a Thursday in July, rehearsing what she would say the entire 2-hour drive, none of it sounding right even to her own ears. Marcus Webb opened the door of a modest brick ranch house, 61 years old, a retired auto mechanic with his father Curtis's same broad shoulders, and looked at the photograph Denise held out to him with an expression she would later describe as not surprise, exactly, recognition. Marcus had known he was adopted his entire life. What he had not known, until that Thursday afternoon, was that his birth mother had spent 58 years one county away, attending the same regional church conferences Marcus's adoptive family sometimes attended, possibly, though neither of them would ever know for certain, once standing in the same room as her son and not recognizing him. The conversation that followed was not the tearful, easy reunion either of them might have imagined as children. Marcus was angry, not at Denise, who had done nothing but find him, but at the decades of silence, at a mother he didn't remember choosing not to fight for him, as far as he'd ever been told. Denise had to explain, carefully, what she'd learned, that Loretta had not given him up willingly, that Curtis had fought and been jailed for fighting, that the silence afterward had been fear, not indifference, enforced by a doctor and a town that made resistance dangerous. It took most of that first afternoon, and several follow-up calls, before Marcus began to separate the mother who actually existed from the abandonment story he'd quietly believed his whole life. The deepest twist came 2 weeks later, when Denise, still piecing together Dr. Sumter's history, discovered something that recontextualized everything. Wendell Sumter's son, Bill Sumter, still lived in Pickford, still ran the family's modest property holdings, including, Denise learned with a cold jolt, a small rental property that had once been part of his father's clinic complex. Bill Sumter had inherited not just land but his father's private ledgers, kept in a storage unit for decades, never destroyed, documenting at least 31 placements between 1958 and 1971. Denise's family was not an isolated case. It was one line in a long, quiet, deliberate record of children moved out of Pickford's black community without their mother's true consent. And Bill Sumter had known these records existed for over 15 years and never told a soul. Denise did not go to Bill Sumter's door looking for revenge. She went looking for the truth, and for the chance that other families in Pickford might still find what she had found. With Marcus beside her, the two of them now talking weekly, slowly building something neither had expected to need, she requested a meeting. Bill Sumter, 68, did not deny what the ledgers showed. He claimed he had not known the full scope of what his father had done until he read the records himself, years after his father's death, and that he had kept them out of a paralyzed mix of shame and fear of legal exposure, rather than malice. Whether that was the whole truth, Denise couldn't say for certain. There would be no courtroom for Wendell Sumter, dead for over 30 years, and Georgia's statute of limitations meant no criminal case could be built against his estate, even if every word in those ledgers was true. But Denise and Marcus, working with a local civil rights attorney and 2 other families they tracked down through the ledger's surviving initials, pushed for something else. Public acknowledgement. Bill Sumter agreed, after months of difficult negotiation, to fund DNA testing and a search registry for any family in Pickford seeking a child placed through his father's network, and to make the ledgers available to a genealogical researcher working with the families directly. It was not justice in the way courtroom dramas promise justice. No one went to prison. No dramatic gavel fell. What Denise got instead was smaller and, in its way, larger. Her brother, sitting across from her at her own kitchen table in Atlanta on Thanksgiving, eating a meal their mother never lived to cook for him. Marcus brought a photograph of his own, a faded picture of Curtis Webb, the father neither of them had really known, holding a baby that could have been either one of them. Denise placed it next to the photograph from the shoebox, the 2 halves of one buried story finally sitting side by side. Was it the ending Loretta Mae Carter would have wanted? Denise believes, now, that it's the only ending her mother was too afraid to let herself hope for. If you were watching this story unfold, ask yourself, what would you have done in Loretta's place, at 17, with no real choice in front of you at all? And what would you have done in Denise's, finding a brother 58 years too late, and deciding whether to call him anyway? Tell us in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the longest. Tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. We read every single one of them, and it means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. If Loretta and Curtis's story moved you, stay close, because next week we're telling the story of a woman who spent 30 years raising another family's secret without ever knowing it, until one letter changed everything. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and let the next story find you. Some of these cannot wait.